5 times in one day, civilians in Israel were still sprinting to shelters, and debris from a shot-down Iranian missile had already ripped into an apartment outside Tel Aviv, leaving behind a dusty baby stroller and rocker. So before you even listen to another politician say the word ceasefire, one fact is already tearing that story apart. This war was still alive enough to reach a child's room. Then Tehran answered with a blade. Not a clarification. Esmail Baghaei did not soften Trump's claim, did not bury it in diplomatic fog, and did not ask for more time. He called the ceasefire story false and baseless. That is the moment the headline stops being about peace and starts being about exposure, and Trump made it worse with his own wording. He talked about Iran's new regime president, apparently referring to Masoud Pezeshkian, even though Pezeshkian has been in office since 2024, and there had been no regime change. So the public version was not just being denied by Tehran, it was already wobbling under its own weight. If you want the layer beneath the headlines, the spin, and the fake endings, subscribe now. And then tell me in the comments who you think got caught first here: Tehran, in a secret retreat, or Trump in a public overreach. Now here's the detail that really blows the cover off the whole thing. While Trump was talking as if Iran had already come asking for terms, Iran's side was still declaring that the Strait of Hormuz was firmly and decisively under its control. A state that still believes it is gripping the world's main oil choke point is not speaking like a state crawling into somebody else's ceasefire story. So that is the real opening question. And it is a dangerous one. Did Trump reveal a genuine Iranian move towards ceasefire, or did he try to impose a victory narrative on a war that had not actually bent Tehran in the way he wanted the world to believe? Because if the answer is the second one, then this was not a diplomatic update. It was a public misfire in the middle of an active information war. The reason this matters is bigger than one bad post. In a war like this, the first side to describe the ending gets a massive advantage, because people remember who looked in control before they remember the messy details that came after. If Trump could make the world picture Iran asking for mercy, then he could make the war feel solved, even if the real leverage underneath it was still contested. That is why the title promise is so sharp. Exposure here does not mean someone got fact-checked in a neat little media segment. Exposure means the public story cracked the second it touched the battlefield. It means the words being sold to the audience moved faster than the actual balance of pressure. Trump did not frame this as a rumor, a contact, or a tentative back-channel. He framed it as Iran having already come in and asked the United States of America for a ceasefire. That is not cautious language. That is conquest language. The language of a leader telling the world the enemy has already started lowering itself in public. And that is exactly why Tehran had to kill it fast. If that line stood unchallenged, then the image would harden immediately. Iran cracked. Trump dictated. America decides. In wartime, that image alone can shift morale, alliances, market confidence, and domestic perception before a single real settlement has even been written. But look at what the White House story needed you not to stare at too long. It needed you to hear the word ceasefire and stop there. It needed you not to linger on the stroller in the dust, not to linger on ongoing alerts, not to linger on Hormuz, not to linger on the difference between a dramatic public surrender and a murky indirect contact. That difference is everything. Because if a government quietly sends a probe through intermediaries, that is not the same thing as asking for peace on the other side's terms. Governments under fire test options all the time. They send signals, float conditions, and check whether there is room to breathe without publicly conceding a damn thing. That is why Abbas Araqi matters here. He had already said Iran had not engaged in talks to end the war and did not plan on any negotiations. Maybe Tehran was lying. Maybe it was hiding exploratory contacts. But that still means Trump's public framing was slamming headfirst into an already declared Iranian position, not emerging from some clear diplomatic breakthrough visible to everyone else. And this is where weak analysis usually dies. It turns into a childish question: who lied? That is not enough. In war, everybody has motive to lie, exaggerate, stage manage, or selectively leak. The serious question is, whose version fits the larger pattern of facts better? That larger pattern did not look like clean Iranian submission. It looked like a war still producing civilian panic, still producing strategic uncertainty, still producing economic leverage, and still producing enough instability that public triumph sounded suspiciously early, That is the pattern. That is the trap Trump stepped into. Even the mechanics were blurry. It was not clear whether any requests had been made directly to Washington at all, or whether some signal had moved through an intermediary such as Pakistan. That one distinction is brutal, because a direct plea looks like capitulation, while an indirect feeler can be nothing more than quiet temperature taking under fire. And if Trump took something quiet, conditional, indirect, or incomplete and blasted into a public picture of surrender, then Tehran's denial becomes completely logical, not because Tehran is pure, not because Tehran is trustworthy, but because no regime trying to preserve deterrence is going to let the world watch it, where the optics of begging, if it can still deny them. That is what the audience clicks for, whether they say it out loud or not. They are not clicking to hear that both sides have narratives. They already know that. They are clicking because they want someone to tell them whether Trump got caught selling a stronger version of reality than reality itself could support. And the answer is yes. Not because Tehran said no all by itself, but because the surrounding facts made Trump's public certainty look thinner, more theatrical, and more politically useful than strategically proven. That is exposure. Exposure is when a claim collapses under the weight of the environment around it. Now bring in the deeper strategic layer. Iran's core play was not to beat the United States in a straight military contest. It was to impose a high enough political price on Trump that he would want an off-ramp before he could claim a neat, finished victory. Tehran did not need to win beautifully. It needed to survive expensively enough that Washington would start needing a story more than a result. That line changes everything. Because once you understand that Iran's strategy was political exhaustion, not cinematic battlefield triumph, Trump's ceasefire claim starts to look less like proof that pressure had worked, and more like proof that the pressure to narrate success had intensified. In other words, the boast itself begins to look like a symptom. This is the kind of shift mainstream coverage often misses. It stays on the quote war, but the real intelligence layer is underneath. If one side's strategy is to make the war too painful to package cleanly, and the other side suddenly rushes to package it cleanly, then you may be watching the strategy work in real time. That does not mean Washington was losing militarily. It means military pressure and political yield are not the same thing. You can break things, kill people, and still fail to force the public image of submission you need in order to close the war. On your own terms, that gap between firepower and narrative control is exactly where this title lives. And Trump widened that gap with his own tone. He tied the ceasefire story to a threat that the United States would keep blasting Iran into oblivion. Or as he put it, back to the Stone Ages. That is not the language of someone calmly disclosing a mature diplomatic opening. It is the language of coercion being advertised as already successful before the political evidence has fully caught up. And when coercion starts advertising itself this loudly, pay attention. Sometimes it means power, sometimes it means impatience, sometimes it means the pressure is real but the political harvest is smaller than advertised. So someone tries to close the gap with spectacle. That is why the early hook of the story had to be violent, not polite. Because the polite version says there were conflicting accounts of possible ceasefire contacts. The truthful, dangerous version says a president tried to publicly place Iran in the posture of surrender, while the war itself was still throwing off evidence that surrender had not been secured. Now the whole thing gets even darker, because the battlefield was never only military. The real center of gravity sat in a narrow waterway that can squeeze the global economy by the throat. That is where Trump's story runs into the hardest wall of all. Senior officials in Tehran were signaling that the Strait of Hormuz and the energy flows around it were leverage Iran intended to use, after the war, to extract concessions and secure strategic aims. After the war, not just during it. That means Tehran's objective was not simply to absorb punishment and endure. It was to endure with enough coercive power left over to shape what came next. That single point rips the mask off the whole ceasefire story. Because if Iran still sees Hormuz as post-war leverage, then Trump's public framing of Iran already asking for ceasefire stops sounding like the reveal of a finished diplomatic turn. It starts sounding like an attempt to seize authorship over an ending that had not been settled yet. And that matters far beyond this one headline. If a war ends without changing who holds the pain lever, then the side that says we're done may not be the side that actually controls what happens next. It may only be the side most desperate for the public to believe that control has already shifted. That is why Tehran had to answer with maximum flatness. Not diplomacy, not nuance, false and baseless. Because if it hesitated, the image would lock in, and once the image locks in, The later correction never catches up. That is how information wars work. The first clean picture often beats the later, messier truth. Even if Hormuz reopened tomorrow, the damage would not vanish with the announcement. Shipping experts were already warning that it would take months to get supply chains back to normal because of the backlog alone. So the war was not just being fought in airspace and press statements. It was already buried inside logistics, insurance, tanker routing, market psychology, and the long tail of disruption. That is why the phrase ceasefire can be so deceptive. People hear it and imagine silence. But in wars like this, silence at the front can still leave a scream echoing through trade routes, energy prices, and global confidence. If the pain mechanisms survive, then the war survives in another form. Which brings us back to the audience's real instinct. They clicked because they sensed the official story was too neat for the moment it appeared in. They sensed that a war this messy does not suddenly become simple, because one man posts that the other side wants out. They sensed there was something underneath the statement. They were right. The thing underneath it was urgency. Not Iranian urgency to surrender, but American urgency to define the war's meaning before the unresolved parts defined it first. That is the deeper exposure. The claim did not just get contradicted. It revealed how badly the White House needed the world to picture a shape of victory that the strategic environment was not yet delivering on its own. That is why some scripts fail on this title. They treat exposed like a partisan insult or a social media gotcha. That is too small. The real exposure is structural. Trump was exposed because the public story he chose to sell was weaker than the war beneath it. The denial from Tehran mattered, but the battlefield, the leverage, and the economics mattered more. So here is the hard dual truth that survives even if every small disputed detail shifts later. If some indirect Iranian feeler did exist, Trump still inflated it into a public story of submission that the wider evidence did not support. And if no such request existed, then the exposure is even more severe, because he tried to narrate strategic control he did not yet possess. Either way, the title pays off in full. Trump was exposed because the story he told required reality to cooperate instantly, and reality refused. The missiles, the panic, the wording, the denial, the ambiguity of intermediaries, and the leverage at Hormuz all pointed in the same direction. Not peace, not closure, not controlled victory, but a rushed attempt to make a dangerous war look more finished than it was. And that is why this lands so hard. In wars like this, the first side to loudly announce the ending is often the side most afraid it does not fully own it. The moment the battlefield starts contradicting the narration becomes evidence against itself. So no, this was not just Tehran being offended. This was Tehran recognizing that if Trump's version stood, the world will start seeing Iran not as a state, still holding dangerous leverage, but as a state already crawling into an American off-ramp. Tehran could not afford that image for one day. Maybe not even 1 hour. That is why the denial came fast. That is why it came hard. And that is why the audience's instinct was right to click. Not because they wanted another ceasefire explainer, but because they wanted to know if Trump had just been caught overselling the war. He was, not because Tehran said no, because the war itself said not yet. Stay with this channel, because we follow the point where the public story breaks and the real one begins.